In the struggling town of Millbrook, master mechanic Jake Martinez was down to his last $20. Facing eviction from his tiny apartment and unable to pay for his son's medical treatments. When tech billionaire Marcus Chen arrived with his rare McLaren F1, a priceless supercar with a mysterious engine problem that 12 expert mechanics had failed to fix, Jake knew this was his last chance. Before we jump back in, tell me where are you watching this video from below, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's episode is extra special. With his small garage about to be closed by the bank and his family's future hanging by a thread, Jake took on the impossible challenge, working day and night to solve the engineering puzzle that had stumped the industry's brightest minds. What happened when Chen returned 2 weeks later to find his irreplaceable automobile running perfectly? And how the grateful owner transformed Jake's life with an unexpected proposition is the extraordinary story you're about to witness. A testament to forgotten craftsmanship, second chances, and the remarkable things that happen when experience meets opportunity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Millbrook's industrial district as Jake Martinez pulled his battered Honda Civic into the parking lot of Martinez Auto Repair. At 35, his weathered hands and tired eyes told the story of a man who had worked twice as hard for half as much his entire life. The arthritis in his knuckles would ease once he got moving, but those first few minutes were always the hardest. He sat for a moment, staring at the faded sign above his one-bay garage, its paint peeling like everything else in this forgotten part of town. Jake reached for the thermos of coffee his wife Maria had prepared before leaving for her double shift at the hospital. The familiar pang of worry struck him as he thought about the stack of medical bills sitting on their kitchen table. 3 months overdue. Their 8-year-old son Diego's treatments weren't covered by insurance, and the mounting costs were drowning them. Inside the garage, the single fluorescent light flickered reluctantly to life as Jake flipped the switch. The familiar smell of motor oil, rust, and determination greeted him like an old friend. This place had been his sanctuary for nearly 10 years. Ever since he'd scraped together enough money to lease it after losing his job at the Ford dealership. Now it might not last another week. The bell above the door chimed as Mrs. Henderson shuffled in, her face creased with worry. "Jake, honey, my old Buick is making that noise again. The grinding sound when I turn." Jake nodded, already reaching for his tools. "Same wheel bearing. Mrs. H, I told you last month it was getting worse." She wrung her hands nervously. "I know, but I just don't have the money for a new one right now. Social Security doesn't stretch like it used to." Jake's heart sank. Half his customers were in similar situations. Good people struggling to keep their aging vehicles running on hope and prayer. He could fix the bearing for the cost of parts, but parts cost money he didn't have. "Don't worry about it," he said finally. "I'll patch it up for now, and we'll figure out the rest later." The grateful tears in Mrs. Henderson's eyes made his chest tight. This was why he'd gone into this business, to help people. But helping people didn't pay the bills, and the bills were crushing him, as Mrs. Henderson left, promising to bring him a plate of her famous enchiladas. Jake's phone rang. The caller ID showed the number he'd been dreading. "Martinez Auto Repair," he answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Jake, it's Frank from First National." The bank manager's voice was apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, but we can't extend the loan again. You've got until Friday to bring the payment current, or we'll have to begin foreclosure proceedings." Jake closed his eyes, leaning against his workbench. "Frank, I just need another week. I've got some jobs lined up I wish I could help, but my hands are tied. The board's already approved the action. I'm sorry, Jake." After hanging up, Jake stood in the silence of his garage, the weight of failure pressing down on him. 3 days. He had 3 days to come up with $4,000 or lose everything. The phone rang again, jolting him from his despair. This time, the caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Martinez Auto Repair. He answered wearily. "Good morning. My name is Marcus Chen. I understand you specialize in difficult engine problems." Jake straightened slightly. The voice was cultured. Professional, carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what they wanted. "I work on all kinds of engines, Mr. Chen. What can I do for you? I have a rather unique situation. A 1995 McLaren F1 with an engine problem that has, how shall I put this, confounded several experts. I've been told you might be able to help." Jake's breath caught. A McLaren F1. He'd only seen pictures of those legendary supercars. There were fewer than 110 ever made, each worth millions. "Sir, I'm not sure I'm the right person for something that valuable. That's more of a museum piece than Mr. Martinez." Chen interrupted gently. "I've been to 12 specialists, engineers with degrees from MIT, mechanics who've worked for McLaren directly shops with million-dollar diagnostic equipment. None of them could solve this problem. What I need isn't more technology or credentials. I need someone who understands engines at a fundamental level." Jake felt a flicker of hope. "What's the problem?" "The engine starts perfectly, runs beautifully, for exactly 17 minutes, then dies without warning. Codes, no obvious symptoms. Temperature normal, fuel pressure steady. It's completely mystifying." Jake's mind immediately began working through possibilities. Intermittent failures were often the most challenging, requiring patience and methodical troubleshooting. "And you've been to 12 specialists?" 12, Chen confirmed. The last one suggested replacing the entire engine with a recreation. That would destroy the car's value and authenticity. "I'd need to see it to give you any kind of assessment," Jake said carefully. "And I have to be honest, Mr. Chen, I've never worked on a McLaren before. I'm just a small-town mechanic." "Sometimes, Mr. Martinez, that's exactly what you need. Someone who looks at the engine, not the nameplate. Would you be willing to take a look?" Jake hesitated, thinking of his tiny garage, his basic tools, the mountain of bills. Then he thought of Diego, of the treatments they couldn't afford, of Mrs. Henderson's wheel bearing. "Yes, sir, I'll take a look." "Excellent, I'll have it delivered this afternoon." "And Mr. Martinez, I pay well for good work." After hanging up, Jake stood in his garage trying to process what had just happened. A McLaren F1, the most legendary supercar ever built. And somehow it was coming to his little garage in Millbrook. The afternoon brought a crowd. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by the time the enclosed trailer arrived, nearly 24 people had gathered to witness the delivery. Jake had never seen so many neighbors on his block at once. The driver, a professional transport specialist, carefully maneuvered the trailer into position. "You Jake Martinez?" he asked, stepping down from the cab. "That's me. Got something special for you today." The man's tone held genuine respect. "Been hauling exotics for 15 years, and this is only the second F1 I've ever transported." As the trailer doors opened, Jake heard the collective intake of breath from the crowd. Even covered by a protective tarp, the McLaren's distinctive silhouette was unmistakable. When the tarp was removed, revealing the car's stunning silver finish. An iconic design, complete silence fell over the gathering. Jake approached the vehicle slowly, almost reverently. The McLaren F1 was automotive perfection made manifest, every line purposeful, every detail engineered for performance. The central driving position, the gold-lined engine bay, the carbon fiber bodywork. It was a work of art disguised as a machine. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a voice said behind him. Jake turned to find Marcus Chen approaching. In his early 50s, Chen carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had achieved great success without losing his humility. His clothes were expensive but understated, and his smile was genuinely warm. "Mr. Chen," Jake said, extending his hand. "I have to admit, I'm a little intimidated." Chen shook his hand firmly. "Please, call me Marcus. And don't be intimidated. It's just an engine with a problem like any other." "Just an engine," Jake repeated with a nervous laugh. "This engine happens to be in a car worth more than most people's houses." "True, but value doesn't change the fundamental principles of internal combustion. The pistons still go up and down, the fuel still burns, the exhaust still exits. Your job is to figure out why it stops doing those things after 17 minutes. Jake nodded, feeling some of his confidence return. Marcus was right. Strip away the mystique, the price tag, the legendary status, and it was still just an engine with a problem. "Can you show me what happens?" Jake asked. Marcus smiled. "I was hoping you'd ask." They cleared the crowd back to a safe distance, and Marcus slid into the driver's seat. The engine fired immediately, settling into a smooth, powerful idle that sent shivers down Jake's spine. The sound was unlike anything he'd ever heard, a symphony of precision engineering that spoke of power. Barely contained. For the next 17 minutes, Jake listened intently to the engine, walking around the car, occasionally asking Marcus to rev it slightly. The BMW-built V12 sounded flawless, its 12 cylinders firing in perfect harmony. Then, at exactly 17 minutes, the engine suddenly died. No sputter, no warning, just silence. Jake immediately popped the hood, checking for obvious issues. Everything looked normal. The engine was still warm, all connections secure. No visible problems every time, he asked. Every time, Marcus confirmed. 17 minutes, give or take a few seconds. Jake closed the hood and stood back, his mind already working through possibilities. Intermittent failures were often the most challenging because they required patience and systematic elimination of variables. "I'd like to keep it for a week," Jake said finally. "Maybe 2. I need to observe multiple failure cycles, document everything, and narrow down the possible causes." Marcus nodded. A lost shop wanted to keep it for a month and still couldn't figure it out. "How long do you need?" 2 weeks maximum. "If I can't solve it by then, I'll be honest with you." "And your rate?" Jake hesitated. He'd never worked on anything remotely this valuable. "What did you charge to work on $1 million supercar?" "Standard shop rate," he said finally. $75 an hour, plus parts. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Martinez, the last shop charged me $300 an hour." "I'm not the last shop," Jake replied simply. "I'm just a mechanic trying to fix an engine." Something in Marcus's expression shifted, a look of respect replacing the business-like assessment. "Very well, but Jake, I want you to know, if you can solve this problem, there will be a substantial bonus." That evening, after Marcus had left and the crowd had dispersed, Jake stood alone in his garage with the McLaren. The car sat under the harsh fluorescent light, its silver paint gleaming. Despite the humble surroundings, he felt like David facing Goliath, armed with nothing but experience and determination. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Diego's fever broke. Doctor says he can go home tomorrow." "How did the day go?" Jake smiled, typing back. "Good, really." "Good, I'll tell you about it tonight." He looked at the McLaren again, then at his modest collection of tools, then at the stack of bills on his desk. Somewhere in this perfect machine was a flaw, a weakness that had stumped 12 experts. But Jake Martinez hadn't become a mechanic to give up when things got difficult. He had 2 weeks to solve the unsolvable, to find the needle in the haystack. to prove that sometimes experience and intuition mattered more than diplomas and equipment. The next morning, Jake arrived at the garage before dawn. He'd spent most of the night researching the McLaren F1, studying technical specifications, reading about common issues, familiarizing himself with the car's unique engineering. His first step was to establish a baseline. He started the engine and let it run while he systematically recorded data, temperatures, pressures, voltages, any parameter he could measure. He documented the engine's behavior minute by minute, looking for subtle changes that might predict the failure. At 17 minutes and 12 seconds, the engine died. Jake immediately began his post-failure analysis, checking every system he could access. Everything appeared normal. The engine would restart immediately and run perfectly until the next 17-minute cycle. By the end of the first day, Jake had run the engine through 3 complete cycles, documenting each one meticulously. A pattern was emerging, but it was subtle, so subtle that it would be easy to miss without careful observation. "Any progress?" Marcus asked when he called that evening. "Some." Jake replied honestly. "I'm seeing a very slight pattern, but I need more data to confirm it." "What kind of pattern?" Jake hesitated. He didn't want to speculate without being certain. "It's too early to say. Give me a few more days." The second day brought visitors. Word had spread through the local automotive community that Jake Martinez had a McLaren F1 in his garage, and mechanics from neighboring towns began stopping by to see the legendary car. Among them was Eddie Rodriguez, a mechanic from the Ford dealership where Jake used to work. Eddie was a good wrench, but he'd always been competitive, always trying to prove he was better than Jake. "Heard you're working on something special," Eddie said, eyeing the McLaren. "Pretty fancy for a guy who can't even keep his shop open." Jake ignored the jab, focusing on his work. "Just another engine with a problem." Eddie: "Right, and I'm sure you'll figure it out where all those experts failed." Eddie's tone was skeptical. "What's the problem anyway?" "Won't start. Intermittent." "Failure," Jake replied without looking up from his notes. "Runs for 17 minutes, then dies." Eddie snorted. 17 minutes? That's weirdly specific. It's probably some kind of timer circuit. These fancy cars have computers for everything. Jake had already checked the electronic systems extensively. The timing was too precise to be purely mechanical, but he'd found no evidence of a timer or countdown function. "Could be," Jake said diplomatically. After Eddie left, Jake continued his methodical approach. He was on his 5th complete cycle when he noticed something interesting. The failure always occurred at 17 minutes. But the engine's behavior in the minutes leading up to failure showed subtle variations, depending on ambient temperature and humidity. That night, Jake called his old mentor, Roberto Vasquez, who had taught him everything he knew about engines during his apprenticeship 20 years earlier. "Jake, my boy." Roberto's voice was warm with affection. "How are you? How's that little garage of yours?" "Struggling, honestly. But I've got an interesting problem I'd like to run by you." Jake explained the McLaren symptoms, the precise timing, the lack of obvious causes. Roberto listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions. 17 minutes. Roberto mused when Jake finished. "That's very specific. It's too specific for random failure. But you've checked the electronics, extensively. No timer circuits, no countdown functions. The engine management system shows no faults." You know, in my experience, when something fails that precisely, it's usually thermal. Something expanding or contracting with heat, but on a very specific timeline." Jake had considered thermal expansion, but the engine wasn't running hot. All temperature readings were normal. "But Roberto, the coolant temperature is steady. Oil temperature is normal. What could be expanding on such a precise schedule?" "Maybe not expanding," Roberto suggested. maybe contracting, or maybe something that doesn't show up on your normal temperature sensors. This gave Jake a new direction to explore. The next morning, he began a more detailed thermal analysis of the engine. Using an infrared thermometer, he mapped temperatures across various components during the 17-minute cycle. Most areas showed predictable heating patterns, but one area caught his attention. A small section of the engine block near the rear bank of cylinders showed an unusual temperature profile. It heated up faster than the surrounding areas, then seemed to stabilize just before the engine failed. Jake spent the rest of the day focused on this area, trying to understand what might be causing the anomaly. It was late afternoon when he made his first real breakthrough, hidden beneath a maze of fuel lines and wiring harnesses. Jake found a small sensor he'd missed in his previous inspections. It was unmarked, not mentioned in any of the technical documentation he'd studied. But its position coincided exactly with the thermal anomaly he'd detected. Jake carefully traced the sensor's wiring, following it through the engine bay until it disappeared into the main wiring harness. Without a complete schematic, he couldn't determine its function, but its location was too coincidental to ignore. That evening, Jake called Marcus with an update. "I found something," he said. "Sensor that's not in any of the documentation. It's located in the exact area where I'm seeing thermal anomalies." "What kind of sensor?" "That's what I need to find out. Do you have any technical documentation? Beyond what's publicly available? Factory service manuals, engineering notes, anything?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I might have something." The previous owner was a McLaren collector who maintained extensive records. "Let me see what I can find." The next morning, Marcus arrived with a box of documents. Among them were factory service bulletins, engineering change notices, and most importantly, complete wiring diagrams for Jake's specific car. "This is incredible," Jake said, poring over the documents. "Some of this stuff I've never seen before." The previous owner was obsessive about documentation. He kept everything. Jake found the mysterious sensor in the wiring diagrams. It was labeled as a thermal protection device with a part number he didn't recognize. According to the documentation, it was a custom component installed during the final assembly process. "Thermal protection device," Jake read aloud. "That's pretty vague, but it confirms your thermal theory," Marcus pointed out. Jake nodded, his excitement growing. "I need to understand what this sensor does and why it might be causing the engine to shut down." The answer came from an unexpected source. While researching the part number online, Jake found a reference in an obscure technical forum. A former McLaren engineer had posted about unusual components used in a small number of F1s, including Jake's car. According to the post, the thermal protection device was an experimental component designed to prevent engine damage under extreme conditions. It monitored the temperature of a specific area of the engine block and would shut down the engine if temperatures exceeded a predetermined threshold. But Jake's engine wasn't running hot. All temperature readings were normal. So why would the thermal protection device be triggering? The answer came to him in a flash of insight. The sensor wasn't malfunctioning. It was working exactly as designed. But its calibration was wrong for this specific engine. Jake spent the next day testing his theory. Using his infrared thermometer, he mapped the exact temperature profile of the area monitored by the thermal protection device. While the overall engine temperature was normal, this specific location was reaching temperatures just high enough to trigger the sensor's shutdown sequence. It was a problem so subtle that it would require precise measurement to detect. The temperature difference was only a few degrees, well within the normal operating range for the engine overall, but apparently just above the threshold for the thermal protection device. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Jake needed to either recalibrate the sensor or address the localized heating that was triggering it. Given the rarity of the component and the risk of tampering with it, he chose the latter approach. The localized heating was caused by a combination of factors: the sensor's location near a heat source, slightly restricted airflow in that area, and the accumulation of heat over the 17-minute cycle. Jake could address this by improving heat dissipation without modifying the engine's core components. Jake worked through the night, carefully fabricating a small heat shield that would redirect airflow and reduce the temperature in the critical area. The modification was virtually invisible, requiring no permanent changes to the engine. But it should be enough to keep the thermal protection device from triggering. The next morning, Jake installed his modification and prepared for the moment of truth. He started the engine and began his familiar countdown. 17 minutes came and went. The engine continued running. 20 minutes, 25, 30. Jake's heart raced as he realized he'd done it. It solved the problem that had stumped 12 experts, including engineers from McLaren itself. He called Marcus immediately. "I've got good news. You fixed it." Marcus's voice was filled with hopeful disbelief. "I fixed it. The engine's been running for 45 minutes without a problem. I'll be right there." Marcus arrived within the hour, his usual composed demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. Jake explained his discovery, showing Marcus the thermal protection device and the subtle modification he'd made. "Brilliant," Marcus said, examining Jake's work. "Absolutely brilliant. You identified a problem that required understanding both the engine's normal operation and the specific quirks of this particular car." "It was mostly luck," Jake said modestly, "and a lot of time spent observing." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Marcus corrected. "This was systematic troubleshooting at its finest. You observed, you theorized, you tested, you solved." They took the car for a test drive, the first time Jake had ever driven a McLaren F1. The experience was indescribable: the raw power, the precision, the sensation of being connected to one of the most perfectly engineered machines ever created. The car performed flawlessly. No hesitation, no warning signs, just the smooth, relentless power that had made the F1 legendary. "It's perfect," Marcus said as they returned to the garage. "After 8 months of problems, it's finally running the way it should." Jake smiled, feeling a satisfaction deeper than anything he'd experienced in years. "Just doing my job." "No," Marcus said seriously. "You did much more than that. You solved a problem that the best minds in the automotive industry couldn't crack. That's not just doing your job, that's demonstrating exceptional talent." As they discussed the final details of the repair, Jake felt a bittersweet pang. Tomorrow, the McLaren would be loaded back onto its transport, returning to Marcus's collection. Jake would go back to working on aging Buicks and Hondas, still facing the same financial pressures that had plagued him for months. But for this moment, he allowed himself to savor the achievement. He had touched greatness, solved the unsolvable, and proven that sometimes experience and intuition mattered more than credentials and equipment. "Jake," Marcus said as they prepared to part ways, "there's something I'd like to discuss with you. Something that might change your life." Jake looked up from his paperwork, curious about the serious tone in Marcus's voice. "I'll be back tomorrow to pick up the car," Marcus continued. "But I'd like you to think about something overnight. What if this wasn't just a one-time job? What if it was the beginning of something much bigger?" Before Jake could ask what he meant, Marcus was gone, leaving only questions and the faint scent of high-octane fuel in the air. That night, Jake sat in his small apartment watching Diego sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. The boy's fever had broken completely, and the treatments were working. Maria was optimistic about his recovery, and for the first time in months, Jake felt hope. But Marcus's words echoed in his mind. What had he meant about something bigger? What could be bigger than fixing the most legendary supercar ever built? Jake drifted off to sleep with questions swirling in his mind, unaware that the next day would bring an offer that would change everything he thought he knew about his future. The next morning arrived with an unexpected commotion outside Jake's garage. By the time he pulled up in his Honda Civic, a small crowd had gathered, and he could see news vans from 2 local television stations parked across the street. "What's all this about?" he asked Mrs. Henderson, who was standing near the entrance, with several other neighbors. "Word got out about you fixing that fancy car," she explained excitedly. Channel 7 wants to do a story about the local mechanic who solved the impossible problem. Jake felt his stomach drop. The last thing he needed was publicity. He was just trying to pay his bills and keep his family afloat. But as he approached his garage, a reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "Mr. Martinez, is it true you fixed a $1 million McLaren that stumped a dozen experts?" "I just did my job," Jake replied, trying to push past the crowd. Nothing more. But the reporter persisted. "Our sources say this car had been 2 specialists across the country. What did you do differently?" Jake paused at his garage door, key in hand. He thought about the past 2 weeks, the methodical approach, the careful observation, the moment of breakthrough when he'd found the hidden sensor. "I listened," he said, finally. "I listened to what the engine was trying to tell me." Before the reporter could ask another question, the distinctive rumble of a high-performance engine cut through the morning air. The crowd turned to see Marcus Chen's McLaren F1 approaching, its silver paint gleaming in the sunlight. Marcus parked the car and stepped out, his presence immediately commanding attention. The reporters surged toward him, recognizing him from his frequent appearances in business magazines and tech publications. "Mr. Chen," one reporter called out, "you're worth over $2 billion. Why did you bring your car to a small-town mechanic instead of a specialist facility?" Marcus smiled, his gaze finding Jake through the crowd. "Because sometimes the best solutions don't come from the most expensive shops. They come from people who understand their craft at a fundamental level." He gestured toward Jake. "Mr. Martinez didn't just fix my car. He solved a problem that defeated some of the most credentialed experts in the automotive industry. That's not luck. That's exceptional skill." The reporters continued their questions, but Marcus politely declined to elaborate, instead asking to speak with Jake privately. They retreated into the garage, leaving the media circus outside. "I'm sorry about all this," Marcus said, gesturing toward the crowd. "I didn't expect the story to get out so quickly." Jake shrugged. "Small towns. Word travels fast. Actually, that's part of what I wanted to discuss with you." Marcus's expression grew serious. "Jake, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound incredible, but I need you to hear me out." Jake nodded, curious despite himself. "I didn't just randomly choose your garage," Marcus continued. "I've been watching you for months." Jake's eyebrows rose. "Watching me? I have people who scout talent for me, exceptional individuals who might be overlooked by traditional hiring processes. Your name came up 6 months ago when you rebuilt that old Mustang for the sheriff's department. They said you made a 30-year-old engine run better than it did when it was new." Jake remembered the project. Sheriff Davidson's 1987 Mustang had been a basket case, but Jake had seen potential in it. He'd spent weeks carefully rebuilding the engine, not because he was paid well, the department's budget was tight, but because he took pride in his work. "Then there was the delivery truck you fixed for Martinez Produce," Marcus continued. "The one that 3 other shops said wasn't worth repairing. You had it running again in 2 days. That was just good business," Jake protested. "Roberto Martinez couldn't afford a new truck?" "Exactly," Marcus said. "You could have told him to junk it and walked away. Instead, You found a way to make it work because you understood that truck was his livelihood. Jake was starting to feel uncomfortable. Mr. Chen, I appreciate the compliments, but I'm not sure where this is going. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Jake a photograph. It was a massive facility under construction, with sleek buildings and state-of-the-art equipment visible through the skeletal framework. This is my new automotive research and development center, Marcus explained. 50,000 square feet, the most advanced diagnostic equipment in the world, and access to any vehicle ever made. Jake stared at the image. It's impressive. I'm building it 20 minutes from here, just outside of Riverside. The facility will specialize in solving impossible problems, the kind of challenges that stump traditional approaches. Classic cars with mysterious issues, prototype vehicles with unique engineering, custom builds that push the boundaries of what's possible. Marcus put away his phone and looked directly at Jake. I want you to run it. Okay. Jake felt the world tilt slightly. Run what? The entire facility. As Chief Technical Director. You'd have a team of engineers and technicians, but you'd be the one making the final decisions. Your approach, your methods, your leadership. Jake's mind reeled. Mr. Chen, I'm flattered. But I'm not qualified for something like that. I don't have a degree. I'm not. You're exactly what I need, Marcus interrupted. Do you know what those 12 experts who couldn't fix my car all had in common? They all had impressive credentials, advanced degrees, manufacturer certifications, years of experience with high-end vehicles, but none of them had what you have, which is the ability to think differently, to approach a problem without preconceived notions, to listen to what the machine is actually telling you instead of what you think it should be telling you. Jake sat down heavily on a stool, trying to process what he was hearing. What would something like that pay? Marcus smiled. Base salary of $300,000 a year, plus bonuses tied to successful project completions. Full health insurance for your entire family, including coverage for Diego's treatments. Housing allowance, education benefits, and a 20% ownership stake in the facility. Jake's vision blurred. $300,000. More money than he'd made in the past 5 years combined. Diego's treatments would be covered. Maria wouldn't have to work double shifts. They could buy a house, save for the future, live without the constant fear of financial ruin. There's more, Marcus continued. I want you to hire your own team. People you trust, people who share your approach to problem solving. If there's anyone from your current network who'd be a good fit, I'd be happy to consider them. Jake thought immediately of Roberto Vasquez, his old mentor who'd been forced into early retirement when the dealership downsized. Roberto had 40 years of experience and a mind that could diagnose problems other mechanics couldn't even identify. I'd need time to think about this, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Of course, but Jake, I need you to understand something. This isn't charity. This is business. I'm not offering you this position because I feel sorry for you. I'm offering it because you're the best diagnostic mechanic I've ever encountered. And I need that skill for what I'm building. Marcus stood to leave, then paused. The facility will be ready in 6 months. I need your answer by the end of the week. After Marcus left, Jake sat alone in his garage, surrounded by the familiar tools and equipment that had been his world for so long. The McLaren was gone, loaded onto its transport and heading back to Marcus's collection. But the impact of the past 2 weeks would last forever. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Saw the news story. Are you famous now? Jake smiled, typing back. Come home early if you can. We need to talk. That evening, Jake sat with Maria and Diego at their small kitchen table. The medical bills still stacked in one corner. The eviction notice still taped to the refrigerator. But for the first time in months, these symbols of their struggle seemed less menacing. So this billionaire wants to hire you. Maria asked her nurse's training, making her naturally skeptical of offers that seemed too good to be true. He wants me to run his new facility, Jake confirmed. It's a real offer, Maria. I checked him out online. Marcus Chen, founder of 3 tech companies worth over $2 billion. This is legitimate. Diego looked up from his drawing. Does this mean we won't have to move, Papa? Jake's throat tightened. His 8-year-old son had been listening to whispered conversations between his parents. Understanding more than they'd realized about their financial situation. It means we might be able to get a bigger place, Jake said gently. And you can get all the treatments you need without us worrying about money. Maria reached across the table and took Jake's hand. What do you want to do? Jake had been wrestling with this question all day. The offer represented everything he'd dreamed of: financial security, recognition for his skills, the chance to work on the most interesting automotive challenges in the world. But it also meant leaving behind everything familiar. I want to take it, he said finally. But I'm scared. Of what? Of failing. Of not being good enough. This isn't fixing Mrs. Henderson's Buick or rebuilding a delivery truck engine. This is running a multi-million-dollar facility with advanced technology and a team of engineers. Maria squeezed his hand. Jake, you just fixed a car that stumped 12 experts. You've been solving impossible problems your whole career. The only difference is that now someone's finally willing to pay you what you're worth. The next morning, Jake called Roberto Vasquez and asked him to meet at the garage. His old mentor arrived within an hour, curious about the urgent request. Roberto, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Roberto nodded, settling onto a stool. Of course, mijo. What's on your mind? Jake explained Marcus's offer. Watching Roberto's expression change from surprise to amazement to something approaching pride. And you're asking me what I think? Roberto asked when Jake finished. I'm asking if you think I can do it. If you think I'm good enough. Roberto was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Jake, do you remember when you first came to work for me? You were 22, fresh out of the army, didn't know a carburetor from a catalytic converter. Jake smiled. I remember. You know what I saw in you then? It's the same thing this Marcus Chen sees in you now. You don't just fix engines, Jake. You understand them. You feel them. You can hear what they're trying to tell you when everyone else just hears noise. Roberto stood and walked to Jake's workbench, running his fingers over the tools arranged with military precision. You've been wasting your talent in this little garage, fixing other people's problems for pennies. It's time you got the recognition you deserve. He wants me to build a team, Jake said. People I trust. Roberto's eyes twinkled. Is that an offer if you're interested? Assistant technical director, full benefits, salary. That'll let you retire comfortably when you're ready. Roberto laughed, the sound echoing through the garage. Mijo, I've been waiting 30 years for someone to make me an offer like that. On Friday morning, Jake called Marcus Chen. I accept, he said simply. Excellent, Marcus replied, and Jake could hear the smile in his voice. I'll have my people start the paperwork immediately. We'll need to relocate you within the next month so you can be involved in the final phases of construction. About that, Jake said, I'm going to need help transitioning my current customers. These people depend on me. Already taken care of. Marcus said, I've arranged for Eddie Rodriguez from the Ford dealership to take over your customer base. He'll lease your current garage space and maintain the same service standards. Jake was surprised. Eddie had been his competitor, sometimes. His rival, but he was a good mechanic and would take care of the customers. One more thing, Jake added. I want to hire Roberto Vasquez as my assistant. He's the best diagnostic mechanic I know, and I'll need someone I can trust completely. Done, anyone else. Jake thought about the young mechanics he'd mentored over the years, the ones who showed promise but lacked opportunities. I'll have a list for you by next week. Perfect. Jake, welcome to the team. 3 weeks later, Jake stood in the center of what would become his new kingdom. The Chen Automotive Research Center was even more impressive in person than in photographs. The main building housed 12 service bays equipped with the latest diagnostic equipment, a machine shop that could fabricate virtually any part, and a testing facility capable of simulating any driving condition. His office overlooked the main floor, with floor 2 ceiling windows that let him observe the work below. The desk was made from a single piece of walnut, and the walls were lined with technical manuals and automotive history books. Roberto walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee, his face beaming with satisfaction. You know, mijo, I never thought I'd live to see something like this. Jake accepted the coffee and gestured toward the main floor, where technicians were installing the final pieces of equipment. It doesn't feel real yet. It's real, Roberto assured him. And it's just the beginning. The facility's first case arrived the following week, a 1967 Ferrari 275 GTB. That had been restored twice but still suffered from an intermittent overheating problem. The owner, a collector from Los Angeles, had driven it to 3 different Ferrari specialists without success. Jake approached the car with the same methodical patience he'd used on the McLaren. He listened to the engine, studied the thermal patterns, and investigated every system with the thoroughness that had become his trademark. The problem turned out to be subtle, a slight misalignment in the water pump that only manifested under specific conditions. It was the kind of issue that would require dozens of hours to diagnose using traditional methods. But Jake identified it in less than a day. Word spread quickly through the collector community. The mechanic who had solved the McLaren mystery was now solving other impossible problems with the same systematic approach. Within a month, the facility was booked solid with projects from across the country. Jake hired carefully, building a team of mechanics and engineers who shared his philosophy of listening to the machines rather than simply following diagnostic procedures. He established a culture of learning and collaboration, where experience and intuition were valued alongside technical knowledge. 6 months after opening, the Chen Automotive Research Center had become the most sought-after facility in the country for exotic automotive problems. Jake had solved issues with everything from million-dollar Bugattis to one-off prototype vehicles, building a reputation that extended far beyond the automotive world. The financial transformation was even more dramatic. Jake and Maria bought a beautiful house in Riverside, complete with a workshop where Jake could tinker with personal projects. Diego's treatments were covered by the comprehensive health insurance, and his condition had improved dramatically. Maria was able to reduce her hours at the hospital, spending more time with their family. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Jake's new life was the opportunity to mentor others. He established an apprenticeship program that brought young mechanics into the facility, teaching them the same principles Roberto had taught him decades earlier. One evening, as Jake was preparing to leave the facility, Marcus Chen stopped by his office. "How are you settling in?" Marcus asked, settling into one of the chairs across from Jake's desk. "Better than I ever imagined," Jake replied honestly. "This place, this opportunity, it's changed everything for my family." Marcus nodded. "You've exceeded every expectation I had. The facility is booked months in advance, and your reputation is growing every day." "It's not just me," Jake said. "Roberto, the team we've built, everyone contributes." "That's exactly what I was hoping for," Marcus said. "You've created something special here. A place where impossible problems get solved, not through expensive equipment or impressive credentials, but through genuine understanding and craftsmanship." Jake looked out his office window at the main floor, where several technicians were working late on a particularly challenging project. "You know what the best part is? These problems that seem impossible, they're not really impossible. They just require patience, observation, and the willingness to think differently. Spoken like a true master craftsman, Marcus said with a smile as Jake drove home that night. He reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. Less than a year ago, he had been a struggling mechanic facing bankruptcy, working out of a tiny garage with basic tools and no prospects. Now he was running one of the most advanced automotive facilities in the world, with a team of talented professionals and a reputation that extended internationally. The McLaren F1 had been the catalyst. But Jake knew the real transformation had come from within. He had learned to value his own skills, to understand that experience and intuition were just as valuable as formal education, and to trust his ability to solve problems that others couldn't. At home, Diego was waiting with his homework, eager to tell his father about his day at school. Maria was preparing dinner, her face relaxed in a way Jake hadn't seen in years. The medical bills were gone, the eviction notice was a distant memory, and the future looked brighter than Jake had ever dared to imagine. "Papa," Diego said as Jake helped him with his math homework, "my teacher says you're famous now." Jake smiled. "Not famous, mijo, just good at my job. Are you happy?" Jake looked around their new home, thought about the facility where he spent his days solving impossible problems, considered the team he'd built and the future he'd secured for his family. "Yes," he said simply, "I'm very happy." The next morning brought another impossible problem, a 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 cell Gullwing with an electrical issue that had defeated specialists on 2 continents. Jake approached it with the same methodical patience that had served him so well, confident in his ability to find the solution as he began his investigation. Jake reflected on the lesson that had changed his life. Sometimes the most complex problems have the simplest solutions, but finding them requires the patience to listen, the experience to understand, and the courage to trust your instincts. The small-town mechanic who had once struggled to pay his bills had become a master of his craft, proving that talent and determination could overcome any obstacle. And somewhere in Marcus Chen's collection, a silver McLaren F1 ran perfectly, a testament to the power of expertise, persistence, and the willingness to solve the unsolvable. The story of Jake Martinez was just beginning, but already it had become a legend in automotive circles, the mechanic who solved the impossible problem and discovered that sometimes the greatest opportunities come disguised as the most challenging problems. In the end, Jake had learned that success wasn't about having the most expensive tools or the most impressive credentials. It was about understanding your craft so deeply that you could hear what others couldn't, see what others missed, and solve what others thought impossible. And that, perhaps, was the most valuable lesson of all. The end.
Hit subscribe and keep watching. More stories waiting for you. Tap the video on screen. Just click and enjoy.